Hey guys, today we are doing a much anticipated review. This is for book 2 of the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. It is called The Hunger of the Gods and I was super excited for this. It is coming out on April 14th. I'm really excited to talk about this book and give you an honest review of how I felt about it. Thank you so much to the team over at Orbit and to John Gwynne for giving me an advanced reader copy so I could get this review out to you before the book releases. This is going to be a completely spoiler-free review, so if you haven't read The Shadow of the Gods, you're still okay to stay and listen and watch, and then you can see my thoughts on both of these books together and whether you should jump into the Bloodsworn Saga. So as I said, The Hunger of the Gods is book 2 in the Bloodsworn Saga, following on from The Shadow of the Gods. It is a Norse-inspired, Viking-inspired fantasy series. In the first book, we followed 3 main protagonists. Here in book 2, we actually follow 5 main point of view characters. A couple of those are much more antagonists rather than protagonists, and I think that's a really interesting thing John Gwynne has done here. It is something that John Gwynne has a track record of doing. In The Faithful and the Fallen, his first fantasy series, we actually do follow multiple antagonists throughout the series. We do get their points of view, we do get to see what's going on, and he has always done a good job at making them relatable when they're meant to be relatable, and really disturbingly villainous when we're not meant to relate to them at all. I think he's done that again really well here in The Hunger of the Gods. One thing that I will say is that I think these extra point of view characters, these extra perspectives, actually did slow down the first part of this book. I would say that the first third of this book or so I actually found relatively slow, and that was partially because we were rotating through so many different perspectives. And actually 3 of those perspectives were from the previous book and I was super excited for, and I knew those characters and I loved them and I wanted to see what they were doing. Whereas the 2 new ones were characters we knew from the previous book, but weren't characters that we'd had perspectives from. They weren't characters that I loved. In some respects, they were characters I actually quite disliked, not because they were written poorly, but because they were more villainous, they were more antagonistic, and therefore it took me a little while to warm up to those new point of views. Although this did make the start of the book a little bit slow, what I will say is that John Gwynne has done a wonderful job of building up these characters, building up these antagonists, and by the end, they were some of my favourite viewpoints. There's one in particular that we got a lot of viewpoints from him, and I really enjoyed the last half of his story. The last half of his arc I thought was absolutely brilliant, and I really like the way that John Gwynne does that. I love the way that we get points of view from antagonists, how we get them to become quite relatable. We actually understand their motivations. In some ways they even seem pretty understandable and quite sympathetic, and I think that's really interesting considering how in the first book we spent the whole book hating them and thinking they were despicable and weaselly and horrible, and actually by the end of book 2 I actually have a little bit of sympathy for them. Now, not to the point that I love them like I love the protagonist of the book, but I do actually have some form of sympathy, and I do actually really want to know where their story goes, and I think that's absolutely beautiful. I think that's really well done, and I'm glad that we took that time to build those characters up, to get to understand them, to see their small interactions with other characters, and to really get to know them. It did make the first third or so feel quite slow, but I think it was totally worth it. Totally worth the payoff by the end. So far, the Bloodsworn Saga has also played into one of my favourite tropes, and this is the trope of long dead magic reawakening. Now, often in fantasy we see the magic dying out, the fantastical diminishing as a trope. It's something we see in Lord of the Rings. It's something that has been a staple of fantasy ever since. But here we get the opposite. We get the trope of a long gone, a long dead magic being reawoken. And that is something that I love. I really enjoy the way that is dealt with. I enjoy the fact that we have this lowish magic world that was being created by John Gwynne that is becoming more and more high magic as we go, and more fantastical and intense, and just massive world-shaking events are happening as we go. I think that, as always, the combat scenes here are brilliant. John Gwynne is probably my favourite author in terms of writing combat, and that is partially because it's very visceral, it's very easy to follow, but it also always has real stakes, and they're not just stakes of who wins, who loses, which is sometimes how I feel like fantasy combat can be written, but the stakes here are more than that. They are interpersonal. They are being developed and revealed throughout the combat, not just by who wins and who loses. And I think that is really well, intricately done, and something I always love with John Gwynne's combat. There are a lot of combat scenes though, and if you like a more thoughtful, slower paced fantasy journey, this won't really be it. This has loads of combat scenes, as did the first book, but they are written exceedingly well. I really, really do love the way that the combat is written here. For the first half of The Hunger of the Gods, I thought we were going to get stuck in middle book syndrome. This is book 2 of a trilogy, and I really felt like we were going to get caught in middle book syndrome, not really resolving enough things, just being set up, just transition from book 1 to book 2. I would say that that really felt like a problem for the first half, and then having completed the book, I do not think it is a problem whatsoever. I think that there's been a really good balance of plot threads that have been resolved and satisfyingly resolved, and there are a load of plot threads, but particularly interpersonal character relationship threads that have been left hanging, and that are left hanging in a way that I am really, really excited to see how they resolve. I think that there is one character in particular where I can see this. If you do a relationship map, if you like webbed out where these relationships go, where his antagonists are, the people who hate him and want him dead, and the people who are supporting him and following him, it's incredible. It's very intricate, and I can see that building to an absolutely ridiculously good crescendo in book 3. Speaking of crescendos, speaking of endings, the ending of this book is super satisfying. I really, really liked it. Things that have been plot threads since a third of the way through book 1 are getting resolved well. Things that have been plot threads since the beginning of this book are getting resolved well. Things that have been plot threads from the beginning and the middle of this book are still hanging, but they're not hanging with nothing occurring. They are progressing, but we can see overarching world-shaking events coming to the fore, and I think that's done very, very well. Even those, though, aren't purely set up, there is a little bit of resolution there as well. You think we're getting set up and then boom, resolved in a really interesting way. And John Gwynne is building up the players here very well. The characters who are going to be big players going forward are really getting built up well. We're getting to understand their motivations. It is very much a heroic fantasy. I know, watching interviews with John Gwynne before, he cites people like David Gemmell as a massive influence in his writing, and that kind of heroic fantasy writing is definitely what John Gwynne is going for here. It is definitely in that theme, in that mould, and I really do like that. I think there is a place for grimdark, there's a place for morally grey, and there is a place for brutal, and there is brutality in this book, do not get me wrong, but I love the more heroic bent to this fantasy. One person can do amazing and heroic and epic things. And in all honesty, there is one thing at the end of this book where I don't think I'm going to forgive John Gwynne. Now, he's caught me out with things like this before, so we'll wait and see how it resolves and whether it has resolved. But in lots of ways, he's really put me on edge here for how this is going to start in book 3. I am super excited for that when it comes out next year. I really do think that the Bloodsworn Saga so far is John Gwynne's finest work. I said when The Shadow of the Gods came out that it was the best first book in the series. It's better than Malice, and it's better than A Time of Dread. And for me, The Hunger of the Gods is one of the best books I have read from John Gwynne. It does all the things that he does well, really, really solidly, and I just love it. I just love it. If you are going into this and you like John Gwynne's books, you are going to love this book. If you're going into this and you've never read John Gwynne, this is a really good representation of how he writes and where his strengths lie. Now, if you don't love a Norse-inspired, Viking-inspired setting, this might not be for you, but I do love the way that he interweaves magic as well as sort of the gods and mythical identity of the Norse gods into his book here. And they're not straight one-for-one swaps from Norse mythology, but they definitely have that feel. They have a really strong Norse feel and vibe to the magical creatures and the dead gods here in these books, and I really love that feel. I've not read much Viking fantasy at all, and I really love that we're getting more of it here in the Bloodsworn Saga. Another real positive I want to finish with here is I think that the side characters are a real strength in this book. I think that a lot of them we don't see super regularly, but when we do, they have a very distinct personality. They don't feel super one note and caricaturish. They do feel like fleshed out characters, and considering how little page time some of them have got because we're split between 5 perspectives and they're not even the perspective character and they're not even the point of view character, I think they're done very well, and I really do feel and sympathise with these side characters a lot. If you've read The Faithful and the Fallen, you'll know that John Gwynne can be brutal to his characters, and there will be character deaths, and there will be characters you know and love who do not make it, and that is something that you should come to expect with John Gwynne books. The body count is high. The body count is always high in John Gwynne books, and people that you haven't known for long but you're starting to really mesh with, they might be on the page for the next 700-800 pages. They might be on the page till the end of the series. They could be dead in 2 pages. That's what you're getting in for with John Gwynne's writing style as well. All in all, there is so much positive for me to say here about The Hunger of the Gods. Like I said, it is a bit slow on the start, so you might have to forgive it that, or you might decide that that's not for you. It's just a little bit too disparate with so many point of views at the start. I know that John Gwynne in Of Blood and Bone scaled in his point of views a little bit. In The Faithful and the Fallen, he had lots of point of views. I think he had 6, if not even more. So yeah, a bit mental. But I think that actually here he manages to juggle those point of views relatively well, but it does lead to a slightly slow start. Once I got to about the 60% mark, I was blitzing through this book. I was really with it, where the plot was going. I was really, really enjoying the character work. And I have to say, even though about 50% of the way through, I thought this might be a 4.5 star read, by the time I got to the end, it's a clear 5-star read. I absolutely adored it. It's possibly... It's hard to say. I love The Shadow of the Gods so much, but I think this possibly eclipses it as my favourite John Gwynne book. But we'll see how we go there. What I will say is, if you like John Gwynne, if you like heroic fantasy, if you like Norse-inspired fantasy, this is definitely a series for you, and it goes from strength to strength here. If you are enjoying and hyped for book 1, I can't see you not liking book 2. I think it is extremely well done, and I am really excited to see where it goes at the end of this series. I hope that's been interesting. I hope that's been informative. If you want to see more of my content, there should be another video up here somewhere, and there should be a link for the Shadow of the Gods review down below as well. And hopefully I'll see you again on the channel soon.